I hope that you are not tired after yesterday's excursions and are ready for our program today. And I am very glad and grateful that our invitation accepted Professor Naomi Millner, and she came and joined us and is ready to share her experience with us. And I would like to ask Beatrice to introduce Professor Millner.
Good morning, everyone. Before I introduce Naomi, our keynote speaker today, I would like to thank you all for joining this talk, and especially to congratulate the local organizers for this amazing conference that brought our community together once again. I am definitely honored to introduce Naomi Millner, our keynote speaker today. Naomi holds a degree in human geography, and she's a professor in environment and culture at the University of Bristol. She has published in several leading journals, including Political Geography, World Development, and she's also the author of the book All We Want is the Earth, Land, Labor, and Movements Beyond Environmentalism, a book that I believe that she will bring very valuable insights for us today. With a critical perspective, Naomi's work addresses many of the themes that we addressed here in this conference as well. From technology for monitoring landscapes to identify drivers of today's rapidly changing world, to the policies needed to respond to those changes. Her provocative talk today will take a vertical and top-to-down approach, ranging from methodological perspectives such as the use of drones to monitor tropical forests, to understanding the indigenous knowledge about the deep peat soils, and through a political ecology lens, she will explore how this conservation supporting technology intersect with conservation policies in conflict landscapes. I'm really looking forward to hearing your talk, Naomi. Please. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction, also for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be here, and thank you also to the organizers for arranging such an insightful and really convivial space. Already the conversations I've had in this conference have enriched my understanding of landscape ecology, and I'm delighted to be here today. So first, I just wanted to introduce myself a little bit further. My first proviso is I don't work primarily in the area of landscape ecology, so it's been a really delightful opportunity to get to know more about the discipline, the subdiscipline, and the interdisciplinary space that is forming around these terms. I work as a professor between environment and culture, so I am also very interested in bringing into dialogue perspectives that come from the ecological and the cultural. And in being here, particularly and reading prior to the event, I can really see a lot of rich potential for a dialogue between the area I work in, political ecology and landscape ecology. And I suppose that's one of my first takeaways, if you like, is the importance of dialogue between these adjacent disciplines that don't always enter direct conversation with each other. So, if you're not familiar with the term political ecology, we like to think politically about the environment and environmentally about politics. So we're often thinking together across diverse systems, understanding how impacts taking place, for example, in the making of states or conflicts impact on the environment, but also how ecological histories and so on impact on society and culture as well. Some of the areas I work in then is particularly focusing on transforming environments, not just what's changing within them, but also different global environmental agendas that may come to land in particular places and therefore have impacts socially on how those areas are managed, on conflicts, on communities, etc. From political ecology, I bring a justice orientation, so that means I'm not just thinking about how different knowledges interact, but also where are the opportunities for more just ways of doing conservation, that are good for environments but also good for people. I use primarily qualitative and ethnographic approaches, so I tend to focus on deep immersion in landscapes over a long period of time, working with communities, using workshops, using conversation in the kitchen or whatever it might be to deeply understand relationships with place. But I'm also nearly always working in trans and interdisciplinary projects where I bring these sort of depth understandings of place into dialogue with ecology, archaeology, paleoecology, and so on. And another key theme in my work has been mobility. So rather than look at a landscape as something that is static, I'm always thinking about what's changing, particularly new ideas as they enter those spaces, new technologies, and I'm going to talk especially about drones today, and also what I might call aesthetics, so particular visual understandings of space such as the wilderness, when that might arrive with a model of conservation, how does that interact with other aspects, with institutions, with practices. So I've made a few provisos. I wanted to also add, in keeping with the first day, a little word cloud. This was made by some of my students after taking a political ecology course. And I'm doing this partly to notice that there are many differences in the way that we approach environments, that we are particularly all coming from a social science perspective primarily, so thinking about power relations, thinking about governance, histories of extractivism of the state, but also many areas of overlap. So, for example, thinking about multi-species relationships, the more than human aspect of landscape, the ways that social and environmental systems interact, and so on. And also another thing is that political ecology, the kind of scale that we look at is also very similar to landscape ecology. The size of our case studies is often quite similar, and a kind of larger, zoomed out focus on ecology, but perhaps more zoomed in than other parts of the social sciences. So the main contribution I want to make today is around this idea of a politics of volume. So I apologize in advance if, for those of you who might be expecting me to talk about how to use LiDAR or drones or whatever to zoom out from landscapes and how to use that. Actually, there will be many other people in this room far more experienced in the technical aspects than me, and will be able to talk very authoritatively about that. My work is not primarily about the technical use of these particular technologies. It's more about understanding the social and political impacts of using particular technologies and bringing volume into conservation. So what I want to talk about mainly today is how thinking critically about height, depth, and remote sensing technologies can enrich the ways that we think about conservation landscapes and also offer new opportunities for thinking about justice within those landscapes. This idea of thinking about the politics of volume I take partly from geography. I'm a geographer, where the insight is that geopolitical power struggles, for example, between states, take place not just via maps and two-dimensional space, but through aerial navigation, monitoring, with management of airspace, laws that affect who can go where, and so on. Within volumetric geographies, the focus is on power and knowledge relationships that happen primarily either by dominating the view from above, and you can think about military warfare in that sense, or by linking height and depth. For example, speaking about airspace or speaking about subterranean depths. And another key aspect of that is the idea of territory, which is to do with the kind of lived experience of space, is made real and contested in vertical as well as horizontal space. So some of the takeaways I've put in these kind of little boxes as I'll go, and one of the kind of main arguments I want to make or bring to this space is that attending to volumetrics in this critical way can help us differentiate between political potentials that are always already coming together in conservation landscapes, even via our own interventions. So when planning this talk, I wanted to move between two quite different and complementary areas. The first, building on work that I've now completed, looking at the use of drones, community drones particularly in conservation, and the second looking at subterranean peats, so the below ground. As time is rather short, I think I'm going to focus for the main talk on the case of drones. If I have time, I'll very briefly introduce the new project on peatland, which is an ERC 5-year project. It's just started, but it speaks to the other aspect of volumetrics, which is about speaking to the below ground and particularly in changing agendas that are making carbon very important in changing landscapes and how they're governed. So first, let's move to the question of drones. For those who use drones in the room, I imagine you have a very specific imaginary of flying objects, quite lightweight, like a hobbyist drone, the kind that when you're on the beach or in the park is really annoyingly buzzing over your head. Many of us probably hate drones. For those who don't use drones or haven't used them in scientific work, they can carry many other associations. So for a long time in the geographic literature, this lent quite heavily on warfare. So some of the same insights are of course relevant. Aerial and monitoring technologies like drones can bring with them atmospheres. They can bring with them a sense of fear, which matters a lot, particularly in conflicted areas. I work mainly in Latin America, so it's really important that long histories of conflict in Guatemala and Colombia, say, might mean that when people hear a drone hovering overhead, they think of a particular moment of warfare. Also, more literally, the threat of being watched or maybe even shot and killed can be used to entrench policing by the state, by corporate actors or partisan groups. If they are using drones regularly over an area, it might change the behaviour of those groups. It might also allow them to take more power in that space. But with my political ecology colleagues who I've been working with over the past years, we have argued that focusing on those military associations is helpful, but risks obscuring some of the other potentials of vertical technologies, such as counter-mapping and community management, and also opening up different aspects of landscape which are incredibly useful to understand. So in the paper on the screen, for example, between monitoring and surveillance, we differentiate those three different angles. The first, securitization, how using aerial technologies might entrench different practices of control. Stereotyping, how using visual technologies that, for example, claim to help track poachers might lead to stereotyping, for example, around who or what a poacher is. And there are a number of case studies looking at the way these technologies can, for example, lead to blurring in people's minds of migrant or ethnic minorities, for example, being framed as poachers, and then the technologies tracking them down rather than a broader discussion over what constitutes poaching. And then thirdly, this idea of data justice and counter-mapping and how drone technologies have become increasingly important in producing data that legitimizes communities' rights to space or is able to produce evidence of the practice they may have produced over decades. So in that paper, we draw on our case studies to develop those arguments. So just to say a little bit more about what I mean by securitization, this is a really key term in the political ecology literature for thinking about vertical technologies. It comes from a wider concern that we see an increasing trend of conservation being used in a sense to drive geopolitics. So it's a little bit like the term greenwashing in the sense of where the name conservation or conservation agendas and budgets are being used, but to open new potentials for extraction or for profit making. But in this case, it's more about militarization. So for example, if you can claim rhinos are being threatened by a particular group, it can legitimize drawing down the use of budgets intended for international terrorism. It can legitimize forming localized forces that have access to helicopter technologies, drones, high-tech, lots of money to be able to then track the people that are identified as the problem. So we're seeing in lots of parts of sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, parts of Asia as well, the agenda of conservation being used to push other agendas, to allow, for example, longer histories of state agendas against ethnic minorities to be made quite legitimate and even attract international funding. So there is a concern to track what is happening around green securitization and militarization, and to ensure that the use of drones, for example, in the tracking of particular animals or the monitoring of forest canopy, doesn't get drawn into these agendas, either accidentally or on purpose by particular groups. And a broader key concept in that wider idea is the idea of war by conservation, which is developed by Duffy, in particular Rosalind Duffy. And here is this idea that sometimes there is a blurring between the idea of declaring war on something. For example, declaring war on threats to rhinos or threats to particular charismatic species can then be used to flip it and almost kind of call for a war on the threats, which then can allow the resources of the military to be turned on whatever is identified as that threat, whether it be a group of people or a wider a wider social problem. So an example of this, which is kind of like the worst case scenario, it's not what's happening everywhere, but Trishant Simlai developed a really important case in the Kulbak Tiger Reserve in India, where drones and camera traps he identified as being used as part of a rule of terror by park rangers who were linked with kind of state agendas. So it was a particular ethnic group that were seen as a threat to the state, and the use of camera traps and drones was set up ostensibly to monitor wildlife, but the data being collected was then being used to threaten communities, to reveal them in compromising positions so that they then would comply with the authorities. The main focus of the work that I've done, however, has been focused on conservation drones, which are obviously not the same as military drones. They're relatively small and nimble. There's a range of drones used in conservation depending on the territory, from fixed-wing, rotary drones, or those that combine the two. They can be challenges with using these kind of drones, particularly in the forest. They can get tangled in a canopy, they can get broken, they have a maximum distance they can go. There are important things to consider about distance in relation to animals and also to human communities to protect privacy. But they can be very useful. And compared to other technological options for monitoring, they're relatively inexpensive. And also, they have arrived in communities via sometimes scientific or conservation interests, and therefore drones may be left with communities, they may be trained to use them as well. So there's a trend for communities increasingly to be using drones to protect their rights, to monitor territories and improve community-led conservation. One of the main areas that I've worked in the past years, and I've built up a long-standing collaboration with this second-tier organisation, is the Millner Biosphere Reserve in Guatemala. So this is a protected area that was created in the 1990s. It was an area that had been largely abandoned by the state. There had been heavy deforestation, and it was a little bit of an international legitimacy campaign in Guatemala that initially was planning a big tourist road, a Maya road, to kind of regain legitimacy after a long civil war. And then there was a big National Geographic campaign, you may have come across it, that raised attention to the forest as an important ecological space. So then all of the resources flipped and were used to create the Biosphere Reserve as an area where community forestry would be developed. The problem was the scheme was initially introduced in a very top-down way. Communities were told they could apply to have concessions to extract timber and also non-timber resources according to external accreditation rules. But the bars were very high for communities that had never done forestry before, and there was a series of failures. Some communities were spectacularly shut down by the state, and it wasn't really working very well. So ACOFOC was an organisation that formed by community leaders in the space where community forestry wasn't really working very well. And they began to accompany communities to understand what they needed to do to apply for concessions, to apply the rules, to extract timber, and then to get better and better at it. So today, this is recognised as an area where world-leading mahogany conservation is taking place, and also it's one of the key examples for where drones and GIS are being used in a very sophisticated way to evidence community capacities. However, it wasn't smooth sailing. From early on, there were claims that communities were mismanaging the forests, that they weren't doing a good job. They were just migrants and they wouldn't be able to do community forestry. And this came particularly from a consortium of interests, including a US-based archaeologist, petrochemical company, and also interests in future palm oil extraction. So one of the reasons that ACOFOC got involved in monitoring was not just to do good community forestry, but to evidence the work they were already doing. So in dialogue with scientists from different universities, they learned to initially use GIS to be able to detect where fires had taken place and be able to evidence that the areas that were under community protection had a much lower incidence of forest fires. Through the evidence they created, eventually in late 2005, the decree that would have lost the concessions was overturned, and they achieved a renewal of their concessions. So here's just a few maps to indicate where we are. We're in the Petén in Guatemala. The map on the right, you can see the ways that it was zoned according to these ideas of core, protected, multiple-use zones, and then here you can see in brown the community concessions, and in pink are the ones that were eventually cancelled, and the blue ones are industrial concessions. However, the kind of threats continued and escalated coming from different sources, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. But I bring this website up on the screen. It's very interesting to me. It pertains to be an international NGO focused on global conservation. When you dig a bit deeper into its finances, into where it came from, it's actually very closely linked to the consortium I mentioned before, the archaeologists, the petrochemical company, and so on. And they're pushing a particular agenda in this protected area, but also more generally in, I think they're now working in 12 different protected areas. I hope somebody at some point does a PhD on this case study, because it's very interesting the ways that money, particular agendas around using park patrols and weaponized protection in parks is taking place. They have a number of campaigns that focus on charismatic species like the jaguar, and then they appeal for money from publics around the world in order to finance their park rangers. But it hides the kind of various agendas that are going on. And one of the things that they do is they use map making to make their projects seem quite legitimate. They've appeared in international newspapers and reporting as well. But when you kind of zoom into some of the work that they're doing, you can see they're using maps to claim that their vision already exists. So here we have a map that's showing the area of a supposed Mirador Park, but the Mirador Park doesn't exist. It's never been granted to exist. It's the vision of a kind of ecotouristic, privatized version of the Mirador area, focused on ruins with a new tourist road and so on, but it doesn't exist. So there's kind of a contestation going on to maintain a particular vision of conservation, and part of it is taking place through particular ideas of the park and the use of technologies to frame it as being a place where good conservation happens. So drones developed, led by ACOFOC, between 2018 and 20 in the wake of these kind of continued staging of threats and scaling up of campaigns that were trying to push them out and delegitimize the concessions. They happened through dialogues with Panamanian indigenous groups, sponsored by Ford Foundation and various South-to-South funds. And over the years that have followed, they have considerably developed their skills. They now have an amazing geoportal you can have a look at that produces high-resolution imagery of the forest, which they use to improve their practices, ensure that the forest is regenerating, but also use to evidence continuously that they're doing a good job. So this context of politics or volume, as I'm calling it, is partly about the idea of contestation within a single space. So there are different contested conservation creations competing in the same space for credibility and finance. We just have some images on the screen. This is showing monitoring and detection, early detection of fires. And just to say, these are being led by a community network that really foregrounds young people in the communities and concessions learning to use these skills. Monitoring of fires around a lake, overflights of fire scars to see the damage, and a style of photogrammetry that can piece together an image of a particular place of interest. And these are three main types of drones they're now using today in Patin. So that's that work that I did over a series of years, as well as some parallel work that I was doing in another interdisciplinary project on the resilience of forests in the Andes, led me to focus increasingly on the role of the drone and how it was changing. Both of those are contexts shaped by war, by a long-standing conflict. In both of them, there were important debates over indigenous rights, community rights to be in particular spaces, but also continuations of state logics that were trying to watch communities or keep particular communities under surveillance. So with other collaborators, I set up a new program called Political Ecology, which was focusing on the diverse potential of drones in biodiversity conservation. We brought together drone practitioners from around the world for an online workshop. The context was COVID. And actually, some of the interventions we did in that time worked better, I would say, partly because we used the online technologies, but that's another story. We also organised this in-person practitioner workshop in Guatemala in 2022 that brought together people from 8 different communities around Latin America, where people were using drones for community management or indigenous land defence. And also we developed some further empirical work that includes site visits in the Colombian Amazon and Guatemalan Petén, and 55 interviews with actors at different levels involved in responsibility with drones, from the military to NGOs, international NGOs, and also community groups. And from that work, I started to think about the idea of the drone as a kind of boundary object. What do I mean by boundary object? I actually saw there is a session tomorrow about boundary objects. The landscape is a boundary object. I think perhaps in landscape studies, quite often the landscape is the thing is held in common, and we explore different relationships in relation to it. One of the things that's different, I suppose, in my work is thinking about the drone itself as an object that is between different worlds, different ways of meaning-making. So the boundary object emerges from science and technology studies. It's the idea of, particularly when you're doing interdisciplinary work, having an object in common in order to be able to develop shared knowledge. Sometimes I flip that concept and think about social conflict through the idea that sometimes conflict can emerge because there's lots of people are using different names for the same thing, or the same name for lots of different things. So when I say drones as a boundary object, what I'm meaning is the drone appears in lots of different people's worlds as having importance and playing a role, but what that role is extremely different. So within the project, we started to map out the different uses of drones. So there are two different kinds of analysis we did with the data. One was discursive, looking at the different ways that people talk about drones and what they're for. And the second was more infrastructural. We were looking at how data moves, how training moves, how understandings of what drones can do moves. And through that, we linked together what we called 4 figures. Figures in the area that I work just is about the formation of knowledge, practice and technology that may adhere the same coordinates, even with different social outcomes. So by that I mean there are different ways of connecting together the ways that the understanding of drone was moving, even in the same space. Let me explain a bit more by going into briefly what each one was. There are 4 that we identified, and both of these are operating in the same protected areas in Guatemala and in Colombia. The first is the idea of surveillance drone, which I laid out in the introduction. So here's the idea that even when a drone is introduced ostensibly for conservation uses, the data it produces might end up with the military, might end up being used to corral particular groups and so on. So this is the idea of a volumetric production of trees, technologies and people as a site of risks, something to be rooted out, something to be watched. This came out partly through our interviews with the UN Office of Drugs and Crime. One of the representatives we spoke to was talking about the emergence of technologies for tracking illegal coca production in Colombia, and explaining how drones had first been introduced earlier, far earlier than drones were being used elsewhere in the country or in science. So around 2010, first aquatic drones and later terrestrial drones were used to detect illegal coca apparatus. But the key point he's making here is that military and big companies are part of driving this agenda because they are at the vanguard of it. They were developing the technology. And this, both technological potential and financial potential, was how they countered illegal deforestation. So what happened through this kind of development was that a pattern was built up of data sharing, so that drone data collected also for conservation purposes would be shared with the UN. That meant they could track down illegal coca. So we start to get this idea of drones being used for surveillance. This also continued. There was a big change of government administration in Colombia around 2017-18, from the Santos administration, where the peace treaty had been brokered, to a new, more right-wing government. And one of the things that happened was some new environmental networking had been developed, the idea of an environmental bubble that was going to use drones to plant trees and kind of build a new technological vision of environmental futures. And when the government changed, that was repurposed into a different operation called Artemisa that was going to tackle the twin problem of illegal groups and illegal deforestation in the Amazon through a very militarized campaign. It's kind of more overt case of green securitization because they were doing it very obviously and very explicitly and with some support of the national public. So what he's saying in this quote is that they had all these planned resources, and then when the government changed, they were told to just turn all those resources over to the new institutions. So it's a kind of code switching, we would call it in my area. the language, the aim, the goal of the technology is changed. But all of the support for aerial forces, including the air forces of the military and its drones, are going to be used for completely different purposes. Not reforestation, but a different kind of war. So this is obviously kind of a sort of dark side of the use of drones in conservation. And one of the big issues with it in Colombia is the lack of conceptual precision. So often the idea that illegal groups and deforestation are one and the same thing is used to legitimize military campaigns. But actually, in fact, often local, small groups of campesinos, peasants, are being collapsed together with the idea of these big elite groups. And then they are the ones who are ending up coming under the surveillance and operations that I'm talking about. So the view from above has a long history and can bear political agendas into conservation landscapes. The second is perhaps more obvious, the idea of the drone as a valuation device, which can enable carbon stored in vastly different landscapes to be rendered commensurable, exchangeable with each other. So here we have the idea of the drone being a flying auditor, producing evidence that is legible and readable primarily to financiers and state regulators. But we can have a wider debate about whether rendering natural capital into dollar signs is necessary and important in order to restore it. But either way, the concern here is that these schemes entering in areas that are managed by communities can reinforce loops for investors and commercial opportunities. What we saw in Colombia as well is that large-scale training in drone use was often being sponsored by finance and security channels, meaning that the direction of training, the way it was happening, was kind of pushing towards these outcomes, even where ostensibly monitoring was happening to see how many trees there were in a particular area. And likewise in Colombia, there was a turn to what we called drone outsourcing, getting private actors who were specialising in using drones to come into the Amazon, which was perceived as a dangerous area, because either because drones were too expensive or because it might be too risky for those who didn't know what they were doing. So you had increasing actors who had no contextual experience working in the Amazon and therefore more potential for conflict. And again, we can continue the debate about carbon credits and their relevance and importance in futures, which is coming up in my new work in peatlands as well. But some of the important contestations that have happened have been over carbon credit schemes arriving in areas managed by communities without their consent or knowledge. So here's an example of a scheme in 2021 where Indigenous communities were granted the right to reject the scheme. And here again, this brings together the work on forests and peatlands because the scheme on the left is in the Paramus, the high moorlands of Colombia, and it's describing an Indigenous reserve that had sold carbon credits to Chevron, the petrochemical company, before communities even knew the carbon credit scheme existed. And in examination, both this scheme and another in the Amazon were raised concerns over transparency when it became clear that some of the actors developing, auditing, certifying, and also buying the credits were some of the same actors. So there's kind of certainly loops that would need to be ironed out for that to be a more just process. I've mentioned community drones, so then coming on to this question of territorial defence. So this use of drones overlaps and often happens in the same way as community drones. We've got community drones being used to monitor state forests to improve practice. But specifically, this is a different use, which is trying to change the terms of conservation and bringing the language, the definitions of Indigenous tenure into the claims that are being made. So, for example, Miriam Santos, who's an Indigenous Shipibo hub trainer in Peru, was explaining in this workshop setting how she was using drones to train others to monitor the threats of invaders, including illegal gold mining companies in the forest where she lived. So it wasn't just about doing conservation, it was about evidencing a threat to Indigenous tenure. And sometimes it's also about defending or contesting different definitions of Indigenous tenure. But also what was interesting to me was the fact that she used the language of dragonflies in her own language, chinchillejos, to explain the way that drones were not just something that were brought in from outside, but were seen as part of the system she lived in. So technologies were understood as something that belonged to the forest canopy, if you like, was part of the multi-species arrangement of the forest. And that's something that's come up in a number of other different interviews. It's also something we'll be taking further in the peatland project, where we're looking at diverse peatland knowledges in landscapes whose governance is changing as they are being redefined as carbon, as peat, as there's not a long-standing history of peat in most of Latin America. And that leads to a third key point that I want to make, which is that indigenous cosmologies and emerging technologies don't have to be binaries. We don't have to think about diverse knowledge as being historical, indigenous knowledge as being in the past, and technologies for the future, the two being threatened. There are ways we could think about more just strategies that bring the two into dialogue. So then this little schematic is just representing these different uses and also the different users of drones, and differentiating between the use of drones to defend and improve conservation protected forests versus uses which are trying to essentially contest what forests are, who they're for, who gets to decide, and bring indigenous sovereignty or an idea of community rights to the foreground. And then this second diagram is equally important because here we're looking at the way that drones may slip, usages may slip, data produced may slip between different user groups and those different functions I was talking about. For example, a drone that is introduced to a forest ostensibly to value the carbon could also be used to survey communities. There could be a slippage in that direction. A drone that supposedly was introduced for territorial defence in a particular area may become a community drone, but it's very rare it goes in the opposite direction, according to our findings. It's very rare that a surveillance drone will end up becoming a community drone, or a neoliberal drone will end up becoming a community drone. So there is important awareness to take forwards in the use of technologies, especially for those interested in using them, in combining this knowledge that there's a need to think responsibly and ethically about how the technologies may be appropriated, even for uses that weren't imagined. Success is always going to be for some. The political ecology question is who wins out and who decides. So out of this work, we produced a series of policy briefings, which you can find online, targeting those who use drones in international conservation, and bringing together our recommendations around the politics and ethics and culture of conservation into quite practical guidelines, and we're continuing that dialogue even today. Now, I was going to talk to you about peat, but I noticed that my time is very short, so I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually skip that. You feel very free to ask me about the new project, but what I'd like to do is instead just come to my conclusions on the points that I'd like to take forward into discussion. So I guess the argument I'm making is it's really important to think critically about the politics of volume, where volume is about height and depth and the way they're being brought together, whether in speaking about aerial space, bringing drones into a particular area, or also speaking to subterranean depths in ways that speaks to what is invisible and what people cannot see. So I invite us to think about volume, but also to think critically about it. Some of the technologies we use have long histories of those potentials, even if that's not what we're trying to do. I really want to push this point of thinking about indigenous and local environmental cosmologies, understandings and knowledge. This is particularly important in the peatland project, where there are many important insights that communities have about peatlands that aren't being taken into account. Firstly, because organisations don't have a language of below ground carbon yet. The language of peat is very new in most of Latin America. But secondly, because there is a tendency to focus on carbon in very particular ways and names, and not value necessarily understandings that might be organised in relation to other species in the landscape or other potential names. Success is always for some, so there's this question of who, when we're talking about success and reaching outcomes, conservation outcomes, whose success are we talking about? I would like to encourage further conversations across the disciplines and in our undisciplined spaces around diverse knowledges in conservation and new technologies. And then some points that I didn't quite reach in talking about how historical uses of landscapes matter in conditioning pathways for how new technologies get taken up, how the carbon agenda takes shape, in some ways privileging the entrance of new corporate actors and others giving communities space to speak. As I just mentioned, the idea that knowledge may be codified under names we're not expecting. Knowledge about forests or peatland might not always use those terms. And then finally, I think this point is shared with men in the audience, the idea that some of these gaps difficulties, conflicts can be overcome partly through effective inter- and transdisciplinary work where we break down the use of jargon in our different areas and have a conversation about how our knowledges come together. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Naomi. The discussion will follow. You can ask questions directly, or you can use from the Streamed Hall Huwa app when you can ask through the keynote presentation questions. Yeah, so we can start discussion.
Talking to people who use drones. Well, I've recently started collaborating with the engineering department in Bristol, working with PhD students who are using drones, so they are the experts. And it's a very productive conversation. I mean, of course, there is a need to understand we have different kinds of expertise, and it's not my expertise area to use drones. But I think in the interdisciplinary spaces I've worked in, explaining methodology is really important, the ways that we work, the assumptions we make, and really insightful definitions can be reached. But it's interesting as an interdisciplinary person, I find I'm often being invited into a space of ethics. So actually what often comes up in terms of people thinking, how is this going to affect me when they are not social scientists or they're not so interested in the social aspect, is how does this affect how I'm going to use drones in this protected area? And in a way I'm very open to that invitation. I think there's a lot of potential to bring the social sciences into the practical use of drones and other technologies through thinking through what could the unthought through consequences be of this action. But in other ways, I think there is a need to think a bit more zoomed out about it, because sometimes that ethics is very, very zoomed in. Could I affect somebody by using my drone? Whereas there's a need probably to have further dialogue if you're working in a protected area, to know what the history is, where, are drones already being used in a problematic way? Has there been a targeting of particular groups that you might need to be aware of? So I think it could be richer, but yeah, it often lands around ethics. Yes, yeah.
I just wonder, would it perhaps be necessary to regulate the use of such new technology that might not be in drones, also in nature conservation law? I mean, nature laws are usually only, so to say, outcome oriented. They want to protect certain things, etc., and they penalize if you don't do that. But maybe also the consensus use of certain methods and technologies needs to be regulated.
I think it's a very good point. And actually, in terms of drones themselves, the regulation is very piecemeal, mosaic-like. So in certain protected areas you can't use the drone at all. In others you don't even need a permit, in others you do. And it's different by state as well. So it's very inconsistent. I think the disadvantage of too much regulation could be that some of the very important uses of drones by scientists and communities could end up becoming impossible. And even though I've conveyed some of the more negative sides, I actually think these sort of aerial knowings and collaborations are incredibly important for knowing better conservation landscapes. But I think there could be a strong case to make to regulate internationally in a simplified way how these technologies can be used. And not only how they can be used, because there's the flying of the drone, but around data. And some of the key sharing points in the policy briefings that we created were also to do with how you collect data of visible characteristics, individual characteristics, and the need to destroy data that could be linked with a particular group or a particular person. So there could be certainly wider agreement about this and a simplified regulation structure, I think. And not only drones, but yeah, other technologies as you mentioned. Thank you. Behind you, I think it's okay.
Yes, thank you. I really like your approach and the question of the power relationships.
The question of power relationships behind the use of drones. One thing you didn't mention, you just mentioned data, but I think one big issue is the whole question of access to storage technology and the processing of the whole drone data, which I think is very tricky for local communities. Do you have any approaches of doing that, which is more equitable?
It's a great point, because sometimes there's a simplified point made that drones are cheaper than other technologies, but it's not just about using the drones or buying the drones or making the drones, it's also about the storage technology, it's about the fixing, what happens when something goes wrong, the training also to be able to use them. I mean, this is a wide global inequality, and one thing is just to recognise it. It has a colonial history as well. But I think many of the coalitions I've talked about are not just community actors, and that's probably important to say. They are long-standing collaborations between communities, scientists, organisations. So sometimes what's happened has been joint applications to larger funding schemes to gain access to financial pathways that allow them to scale up their work. That's certainly what happened with Aquafoc. But that's, yes, it still means that some people will have access and others will not. That's a really important point. Thank you.
Alma from Finnish Environment Institute. Thank you very much for your presentation. So I'm a human geographer who made her doctoral thesis on critical nodes on laser scanning and drones as well. So your message really, really resonates with me, with my thoughts. Thank you so much. So you talk about the vertical data, the vertical aspect, which is really, you had really critical, great notes. And you talk about it from bird eye view. But also there is it true that we should also concentrate now on what is happening on the street level? And also with other sensors, as many of you know, many of our phones, for example, here on the tables have different kind of sensors, for example, lidars, some of them. And what do you think about the idea of the threat that many private companies are gathering environmental information, all kinds of what you also referred to now with the sensors that we don't even know that are existing within our private area? And what do you think we could do, and what we should address in research for that?
Thank you so much for the question. That's a really rich area. I'll just make 2 quick points about that because time is running low. The first is about the idea of the God's eye view, which is something that in the social sciences is sometimes critiqued, associated with the idea of objectivity, seen from above as if you are like the master viewer. Part of what we did in that article is to trouble that idea, because the God's eye view or the bird's eye view in many indigenous cosmologies is not necessarily distant. It's an animal. It's something that circles and comes back down. So again, repeating this idea that what we understand of distance and closeness isn't always there's not only one way of thinking about that. And also the indigenous technologies may help us rethink how to have an ethics of the bird's eye view that isn't necessarily distant or trying to think itself the only possible view. The second point you made is just a really valuable one. My colleague Jennifer Gabrice works a lot on the politics of census, more generally thinking about how it's changing. Of course, it's changing the social fabric in all kinds of ways. There is a linked discussion about algorithmic technologies and conservation, how they change the ways we make decisions, whether you can question them or not, if it's happening very quickly and very automatically. It's not directly the work that I do, but it's very interesting and very relevant and something that's changing rapidly. So it's another kind of side conversation. Another?
It's just curious about the coalitions you just mentioned, it's just a curiosity about the coalitions that you just mentioned, where local communities also work with scientists to process the data of the drones. I was wondering, do you know if those coalitions are also empowering the local community to also learn how to analyze and understand and use the data, or they are just mainly staying with using the drones and so on?
It's a really good point, and the concept I used at one point in the presentation, data justice, there's bigger discussions about what constitutes that justice. Is it just being represented? Is it having the right to say no, to have yourself represented? Is it being allowed access to a map? Is it being allowed to learn technology? So the answer is all of those schemas are existing in the world, I would be very much for ones that situate people as knowledge bearers in their territories, and therefore that promote people having a role in not only analysing the story, the data, and that is certainly happening in lots of the schemes that I mentioned. Also the workshop that I mentioned, one of the key parts of that, we were bringing questions of like what affects the way you use drones, what are the limitations, what are the ethics, but also there were spaces where people could problem solve with each other the issues that they were facing. And I think it's becoming increasingly common to have transversal dialogues between communities because the issues they face are not necessarily the same as the ones analysing data for writing a scientific article. So I would say yes, there are coalitions that share those capacities or where people build those skills, and also it's happening sideways as well.
Okay, thank you very much, and for the fruitful discussion, please applause.